Okay, so this upcoming talk now, Proactive Password Leak Processing with Bruce Marshall. I know the schedule says 25 minutes. It's going to be a bit more than that, up to maybe 50 minutes. I don't know, we'll see. And as I said before, you can very easily go without food for several days. So even though there's lunch afterwards, I will highly recommend you to stay here and listen to the entire talk. Because this is going to be a good one as well. Bruce is one of those that have been with us ever since we started doing PasswordCon in Las Vegas 4 years ago. So I will just leave the stage for him. Go ahead, Bruce.
All right, thanks, Per. So yeah, I run the passwordresearch.com website, which I started 10, 15 years ago, not quite 15 years ago, to try to gather some of the research, specifically starting with the academic community. But then I've since added more from events like this, which I would consider non-academic for the most part, and trying to share that information, make it more accessible, and essentially provide an index to people like us who work in the private, industrial, government type fields, so we can benefit from some of that knowledge. And my last couple presentations, as Per has mentioned, I've presented several different times on security questions, on passphrases like DACE-aware XKCD, style passphrases, and password expiration. And some of those have been driven by data that I've found, like the security questions and password expiration was based on password data that I had and some internet dumps that had security questions and answers. And this is one that's been a little bit different because I started out just hearing about these companies looking at leaks, like Microsoft going out. They announced here a couple months ago they were going to start, and maybe they've already been doing it for a while, but they announced at least that they were going to be looking at password leaks and looking at things like that to try to protect their accounts of their users, their customers. And so as I was collecting this information, I started hearing more and more about it, and I decided that I wanted to kind of try to gather what we know right now that companies are doing and talk about the techniques that they're using and talk about the different alternatives you have if you're considering this or if you're debating whether it's even worth your time. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that now was because in some ways, in some things in the industry, we kind of get broadsided by stuff by either auditors or standards, OWASP or SANS, or somebody comes out with a new guideline on something, and then we have to figure out how to do it. So this is kind of my way of helping start that conversation along before we're too far in where 99% of the industry isn't doing anything related to this. So let's get right into it. And like Per said, there was some confusion. I had thought that I had a 55-minute slot, so I have about that much material prepared, but I'm going to try to pare it down to probably closer to 30, 35 minutes. Try to be respectful, but we'll see. I have no guarantees.
Have you had breakfast? No. So you can wait. Go on.
Yeah. You just raise your hand, and Per will bring you a little cup of juice. And
I'll be looking up yours. There's no way of getting out that way.
Right. So password reuse, if you're not sure what that term means, basically is a person using a password on multiple sites or multiple applications. Typically, in this case, we're primarily interested in the internet, but you could say it in a corporate environment or something like that. And so to try to measure the extent of it, I'm going to give you some stats, and this is where I'll kind of not spend a lot of time. But there's several different ways we can kind of measure that, and there's additional stats that I don't have just because there's more than we really need. But just to give you a rough sense of it, when actually asked what they do, which can be somewhat problematic because people either idealize what they do or they underestimate what they do. Roughly, anywhere from 46 to 60% of people say that they at least use passwords on several sites, or they reuse passwords for different places they go on the internet. We can actually see that too in some research that's looked specifically at password leaks, which password leaks are essentially if a company gets hacked, like if you were in for Michael's last presentation talking about some of the data that gets dumped out. They can compare passwords between the different users that are in both of those dumps, both of those that were hacked from both of those organizations, and see if they matched and kind of get a better feel for that. And so one of the research papers, academic research papers, was looking at how many had exact matches versus slight modifications. Maybe the password policy is different on one site than the other, so they had to add a capital letter where normally they wouldn't have one, or add a number. or maybe some people like to do little prefixes, like for Facebook, the first 3 letters are FAC, things like that, where they felt like they were reasonably predictive. And I guess I skipped it on the first slide, but these numbers and brackets here, I'm big on references, since that was the point of me starting my website, was to point people back to the original sources of data. And I'll have the references section at the end. So if you see something you want to dig in further, just write down the number, and you can see actually where it comes from and do some reading yourself. Troy Hunt also did some comparison between Yahoo Voices, Sony Pictures, and similar type of thing. He saw that around a little bit under 60% use the exact same password within that sample, and 2% had slight capitalization differences between those passwords. And finally, probably even the most accurate, or at least more insightful, is monitoring what people do within their web browsers. And one study and one kind of industry type study have looked at that. Trusteer, data is getting a little bit old now, but I don't imagine things have changed too terribly much. Basically a browser extension that would monitor where people were using their passwords for those customers. And I want to say that they had like 4 million different people that had that extension installed. And they were able to see that just specifically focusing on financial sites, that 73% of the people used their bank password or their credit union, whatever, to log into at least one other site, which you would think that's very bad, and you would be right. And then also the fact that they may have a different ID, but they on other sites too, but they use the same password. And then in a smaller review of just more recent, but smaller review of university students, they did a similar thing, installed a browser extension, looked at how many different sites they had versus how many passwords, and there's a lot more details in the studies, and I'd encourage you to dig into if you're really interested, but 85% had fewer passwords than websites that they went to. So why is this a problem? Because of the ATO, or account takeover threats, kind of what that type of attack has been labeled, where we as site owners start getting attacked because our users have made choices to reuse their passwords. Now, account takeover is not just a result of password reuse. It could be a result of poor password choice. It could be someone's computer having a Trojan installed in it. There's different reasons for it, but password reuse is one of the threats, is one of the causes of account takeover. And credential stuffing has kind of been the name that I think Shape Security kind of introduced that, and then OWASP, it's now on an OWASP wiki page, so it must be our standard, for using different credentials across multiple sites. So if you hear people say credential stuffing, that's what they're talking about. Account checkers then are the actual tools. I mean, anybody can write scripts that do password guessing against websites. I mean, we had a talk yesterday about my BFF, my brute force framework, that was talking about using that against specific login systems. And there's lots of custom, like if you go out and Google Facebook account checker or Instagram account checker, you'll see different standalone programs. But there are some that are more versatile. Sentry MBA seems to be one of the most professional grade tools that you essentially set up. You can go automatically run it through proxies. You can have it. It can even interpret some OCR. So if you start getting an account lockout threshold where OCR prompts are being, or OCR, catchput prompts are being provided, it can OCR those and try to, essentially bypass the "Are you a human?" check. But Shard and CredMap, and I think Shard came out this year, those are specifically designed to try credentials across multiple websites. So you provide it with a credential list, and it tries Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, whatever else are programmed in there. So these tools are out there. They're available. In fact, they can be customized. I think there's essentially a template you can create to have it go try. Like if you want to add a site that's not in one of these existing tools, you can go out and create that, get the parameters for the username, password, and maybe the failure success messages, and go out there and do this. So the tools are there. This is, in part what people are using in these account takeover attacks when people are sharing passwords. So how is this real? How often is this happening? All the way back in 2003, Google talked about seeing types of attacks against their sites. A million different Google accounts every day for weeks at a time that they were trying to combat. And we kind of talk about the online guessing limitations where it's not nice, not nice like offline password guessing where you can do billions of attempts a second depending on what password hash. Online, you're typically thinking, well, they're going to have account lockout, or they're going to have IP blocking, or they're going to have something like that. And as we'll talk about in a minute, there's ways of getting around IP blocking, but they even back then saw like 100 accounts per second, which is 6,000 account tries per minute, which is a pretty substantial rate if they're having success. Today, most recently, Microsoft said every day they see 10 million, and they've since updated it to like 12 million or more credential attacks every day for the systems that they manage, their Microsoft account systems. So it's definitely a growing problem. Yes?
Did you make an outrageous speaker request?
Can you make one?
Did you make an outrageous speaker
I
request?
hope I didn't.
For no brown M&Ms?
Oh, yes. Thank you. I appreciate it. That was part of my rider. Thank you. You never know if people are going to read those, so apparently they do.
Oh, we do. We read everything.
All right. So those private comments to you went to everybody. All right. Akamai is...
You didn't tell anyone what you were actually going to do with those.
Oh, okay, right. I appreciate you keeping that personal. Akamai monitors a lot of the sites out on the internet, and they're able to see some more insights on their customers beyond just a single customer type of a situation. And they released this year in one of their reports, like nearly a million IPs being used in one single attack against a financial customer. Throughout that period, 427 million accounts checked. And a different customer, which I think they said was in the entertainment industry, was the second one here, 817,000 different IPs. And looking at those IPs, of course, because they've got insight into both of those, they're able to see that there's about 70% overlap between them. So they're using the same botnets, or it's the same gang of people running these different types of attacks, or there's definitely some correlation between those different attacks. So they're out there, they're trying, whether it's your site yet or not. I mean, only you, probably or hopefully your logs will tell you. One of the interesting things that also Akamai said in that same report was that when new password leaks come out, like LinkedIn and MySpace and some of the others we've seen this year, they see spikes in account takeover, credential reuse type activity. They're specifically monitoring that types of stuff. And one of the biggest examples that happened last year was Taobao, the Chinese, kind of like an eBay reseller type site. They were hit in the middle of October with what authorities later said was a collection of 99 million credentials that successfully got them into about 20 that matched at least 20.5 million active users on the Taobao site. Now, Taobao said that they didn't actually get in. They got blocked by maybe, some contextual authentication type stuff. They came from the wrong IPs, or they had suspicious browser strings or something like that. But regardless of how many they actually blocked, the resulting crime resulting from getting into those accounts was around $1 million worth of fraud that they detected and then had to deal with on their site. In less widespread nature, there's been a lot. TechCrunch here just in the last couple weeks got hacked into due to a shared password in their content management system, and briefly someone posted a fake article. GitHub had problems, the same type of thing after LinkedIn came out. The most recent LinkedIn leak that their users were being attacked with reused credentials, and they had to respond to that. And Shatbao was another one that said that someone got in because of a third-party breach and the credentials being the same as on one of their administrators. So it's hard to quantify how many people have suffered account takeover due to password reuse, because we often don't know why their account was taken over unless they say specifically, oh, I had the same password between eBay and my Facebook account. But we know as far as just account compromises in general, roughly 25% of the population has experienced that in the past year and had to deal with the outcomes of that based on this survey. So why does that happen? I don't really want to spend too much time on this. There's lots of different reasons for people to want to get into accounts. Often you think, like, why does someone want to get into my Starbucks account? I can understand eBay or my bank, but why my Starbucks account? Typically there's some way they can either get money out of it, they can get social proofing, they can do different things that are going to add value to them, or that they can sell to someone else that is interested in doing those things. So I guess one of the questions that we kind of have to answer is it our responsibility to care? Someone's chosen to reuse a password, and there's been research that says that people reuse passwords in part to deal, as a coping mechanism, to deal with the overload of passwords that they have. They don't try to choose something super complex so they can remember it. They try to reuse it in certain situations because they want to relieve that memory burden that they have of having, if you had to memorize a password for every single service or account that you have, that could be overwhelming. So they made the decision to reuse that password. Maybe they weren't as informed as they could have been, but they did make a decision about that. So we do have the option, and most of us are in that default option right now, which is we're not doing anything. We wait until an account gets hacked and we respond to it, and we can continue to do that if we want to. So from a perspective of back to what do users know, there's an excellent paper. I don't think Dr. Craner is in here, but her team at Carnegie Mellon has done great research over the last few years, but one of the papers that I recommend pretty much anybody dealing with password policy or authentication decisions is this one called, I added a exclamation mark at the end to make it secure, which is where they sat down in a lab and they asked people to create passwords for like a newspaper site, a bank site, and an email account. And they looked at what they did and kind of had them talk through the process. Okay, this is my bank account, so I want a stronger password. Or this is my email, so I want it to be something I can type in quickly. They got that feedback from the people that they talked to. And then they also talked to them after the fact, why did you choose to make your bank password the same as your email password? And so they specifically got feedback on password reuse. And a lot of people say, kind of like, well, we know it's a bad thing to do, and I probably shouldn't be doing it. I'm not as concerned because it seems to not have any consequences for me. They're part of that, maybe 75% of the people that haven't had their account taken over or that they can't trace back to password reuse being a problem, which, you can't argue with experience. In some cases, somebody can reuse a password and never have problems with it. It depends on some of the other factors of if that password is going to get disclosed through an attack or a breach somewhere. So, but part of the problem is that they don't have the same education that some of us have as to what constitutes good and bad password decisions, what constitutes risky situations that may expose their password to compromise. 3 of the different people that they talk to, say, hey, if I've got a good password, I reuse it. I don't see a problem with that. My reused password is not easily guessed. No one can guess my reused password. Well, so the researchers then took the passwords that were generated as part of this lab experiment, used Hashcat blindly without, with someone that didn't know what the values were, to crack those resulting passwords or attempt to crack the passwords. And 2 of these 3 people had their passwords cracked. So maybe not the best, judges of someone being able to guess their password. So that's my perspective. I guess one more here. This was a guy that recently just came out here. He was contacted by a news agency because his password had been breached as part of a O2 compromise over in I guess, England. He talked about, well, I reused that for O2 and eBay and Gumtree, and up to that point, he'd considered himself secure online and internet savvy. So, from his perspective, maybe he had thought his password was good enough. But the point being, sometimes we have to provide that guidance back to users. We establish minimums or we establish standards, and users say, well, if you're saying I only have to, do 6-character passwords, then that must be sufficient. So, the Office Space flare scene here came to mind as far as that argument of, why did you set the standard to this if this wasn't sufficient? And password reuse, it's a little bit harder for us to set standards, but our actions do kind of speak to that same question of, is this acceptable behavior or is it not acceptable behavior? Users do also kind of have mixed feelings about who's responsible for that. In one survey, 56% said the sites that they visit had ultimate responsibility for their account protection. And another 39% said that websites are to blame if they have account compromises because they didn't offer the right security features. Whether that's multi-factor or stronger passwords or whatever it may be, they're placing some of that blame on it. So I would say, given this, we kind of have a shared responsibility. Alex Stamos, who's now the Facebook CSO, spoke at an AppSec conference here last year, where he said, he was asked in the Q&A session, what's the biggest challenge for Yahoo? And he said user security, and then broke further down in talking about how they deal with password leaks and password compromises, and saying, in theory, there's nothing we can do about that, right? The user's choosing to share their password. They're making a choice. We don't really have any role in that choice. But he said in practice, it means they need to kind of readdress how they're dealing with passwords, how they're dealing with their users, and how to limit the risk of those compromises because the user's not capable or not willing to do that for themselves. So I thought that was a very pertinent quote related to this discussion. So there are different things you can do. We're going to focus on password leak processing, but I did want to kind of talk through these, and I'm not going to spend as much time. I was going to go into blacklisting a little bit more and contextual risk-based authentication a little bit more. But one of the bad things you can do is to enforce regular password expiration. And that's been talked to a couple other sessions in this conference where if people are changing their passwords every 60 to 90 days, they at least can't have they probably won't have an exact match to their other accounts because they'll be incrementing the number on the password that they've been forced to change. Maybe a slight difference, and as we talked about earlier in some of the leak processing, people are able to guess those transformations fairly easy. So not a great way. Incident-driven would be like Citrix Go to My PC and Pandora. Was it Pandora? Let's see if I had one. Oh, Carbonite. Carbonite was the other one. Whoops, there we go. So Pandora and Carbonite, or Go to My PC and Carbonite detected password guessing attacks on their sites and just reset everybody's password, forced everybody to change their passwords. That's a fairly, scorched earth type of policy. It can work, but how often are you going to be able to carry that out and not upset your users? I mean, there was a lot of people that said, I had good passwords on your site, especially with Carbonite where you're doing backups with it, and now you got to change service passwords and stuff to make sure that it actually continues to back up. That can cause a lot of disruption that your users may not want to deal with. You can design unusual password policy requirements. If you start making sure that people have to start it with no space, no symbols in their password, or they have to have 2 symbols in the middle of their password, or Mark Burnett has a great site, Twitter feed of PW2 Strong, which he retweets all the different terrible policies and different sites have. There's tons, and I don't think that typically they're designed to do that, but that is one way that someone could approach this problem, saying, well, come up with some crazy requirement. That way they won't possibly have the same password on our site as others. You can assign random passwords to users, or they don't have to be random. I mean, they could be semi-random or whatever, but you could assign passwords to users. Linux Mint was hacked earlier this year. Their forums and their partner sites or community sites their database for those were hacked. And as a result of that, one of the choices they made was to just randomly assign all their users passwords for the new passwords. That lasted about a week. After that, they realized that people weren't really happy with that choice. They wanted to be able to choose their own passwords. For some of us, it's not as big of a deal. We just plug it into our password manager and go on our way. But for others, either they're trying to have to memorize that or writing it down, or they're just not pleased with having to deal with that possibility. Very high secure sites, you might get away with that. Maybe you can justify that and your users aren't going to react too strongly. Eliminate passwords altogether. And this is what kind of Yahoo, with their Yahoo account key and some other sites like Medium have adopted, where they just basically say, if you want to log into the site, plug in your username, we'll send you an email. You click the link in the email that has basically a session key that logs you into the site. You don't need a password anymore. Everything will be done through your email you need a password for, but that's not our responsibility, their responsibility anymore. That's, for some sites, I think, again, lower security, that may be an option you're willing to go with, just because the passwords then aren't, you have to worry, they have to worry about their email password, but from your perspective, there's nothing else you really have to worry too much about. Two-factor, multi-factor authentication, two-step verification. I mean, we've been encouraging that for years, so regardless of password use, because of all the other password and account takeover threats, it's a good idea. Probably goes without saying. But it is nice if your password isn't the only line of defense. So if someone guesses your password, they still can't get into your account. That's ideal. Blacklist from leaked passwords, and this is, I'll talk briefly about this, but and Jim mentioned yesterday in his talk about the new NIST standard that there's some pushes towards, instead of just reacting to people's bad choices after the fact, when you see it in a leak, you tell them, yes, that was a bad password. I mean, not all leak passwords are bad, but presumably some of the passwords are, and then you would be telling them not to use them. You could just create that list from scratch or create it from leaked passwords. There's services out there. Password RBL is one I talked to. He's got millions of passwords essentially that he's compiled from leaks, from attack tools that have password username, combo lists, from different places like that that you can subscribe to. You can generate your own blacklist, but you can essentially try to prevent those from the start for all users rather than just saying this one user can't use this one leaked password that we found that they were using somewhere else. Contextual risk-based authentication, there's lots of different names for it, but it's essentially looking at other factors that you're monitoring more passively that are associated with the user's login experience. So you're looking at IP and geolocating that IP to their normal location. So if I log in from the United States and suddenly I'm coming from Europe, they may flag that for they can essentially flag that as a higher risk type of authentication transaction. LinkedIn is doing this and did a great talk at Enigma conference this year. David Freeman there, I think it was called Server-Side Second Factors. And he talked about essentially the formula that they use to determine risk, browser agent, time of day, all the different IP factors. And they also talked about their success at combating things like account takeover fraud, the fact that just by looking at country, they could eliminate 90-some% of automated, those like the Akamai data, the automated large-scale attacks because they were coming from other countries. And some of the other things like that. So that's certainly something that I think, regardless of whether you're doing this just to combat password reuse, this is a good thing that you should be looking at if you're not already having it implemented. All right, so finally, the approach we're going to talk in more detail about is looking for password leaks on the internet from other sites, possibly from people claiming it to be your site, and then compare that to your own users. So here's my obligatory kitten picture, but so your goals are doing this is to reduce account takeover. You probably want to eliminate it, but to reduce account takeover based on risks that you know to be there. If this password leak is out there and other people have access to it, those accounts by logic have a higher chance of being attacked. So you're trying to get ahead of those attacks for presumably the riskier accounts, at least from this perspective. I haven't seen or heard feedback from the companies that are doing this. I would assume that there's some money savings from having to, for dealing more proactively with eliminating account takeover threats before the account takeover has happened, when you're not engaging customer service and admins or whoever else has to deal with compromised accounts and possibly the loss of business that goes along with customers being frustrated that you didn't protect them even though maybe it was their bad choice that led to the account takeover. And then also, as we talked about, demonstrate some security commitment to your users, to your investors, your auditors, your management team, whoever's kind of in that field of needing some reassurance. So if you've never seen leaks before, if you're not quite sure, I'll give it a brief explanation. Typically, it's going to be just data that's posted on the internet. My experience, and I'll talk a little bit about this, the data that I collected a couple years ago was most of at least the small time compromises come from things like SQL injection, where sites predominantly running PHP would either not program properly to resist SQL injection, so the attacker can then dump their entire user database, get the passwords, usernames and things like that. Sometimes in bigger cases, it comes from just outright server compromises where they compromise an application server and then have connections back into the database server that they can pull the data out of. But there's also cases where Trojans and malware are collecting it. I think TrustWave did an analysis about the Pony botnet, and they had several 100,000 passwords that had been collected by the Pony botnet over, I think, a 6-month period or something like that. Phishing, of course, tends to be somewhat lower scale, man-in-the-middle attacks. And then there's compilations where people may just collect data over time and then will it down and say, okay, I've grabbed Gmail addresses from 7 different sources, and now I'm going to put them all in one file and call it a Gmail dump, password dump, even though it didn't technically come from a hack of Gmail. Some will be duplicates. people kind of use this as a bragging right in some cases. They put their name on the top and say, hey, we hacked the FBI or we hacked Gmail. And some leaks, of course, as you probably have heard, don't just contain password data. The Ashley Madison compromise contained all sorts of personal data. The healthcare breach that happened that was, or I guess, was a leak that was kind of given publicity this week has all sorts of healthcare information. So they're not just limited to, username, password, email. There may be lots of other data within them. So you kind of, if you're deciding to do this, you kind of have to make some decisions, and you can be somewhat flexible on this. It's not a binary, yes, we're doing everything, or no, we're not doing anything type decision. Probably the most important one is for you to decide if you're going to be looking for data that comes from your own site, looking for signs of compromise, or looking for signs that someone is sharing data that supposedly comes from your users or your employees. After that, probably you're going to be looking at easy leaks to process. So the larger leaks that have plain text passwords that you don't have to worry about cracking anything, you don't have to worry about going through much effort to parse the data or try to go out there and find the data is another, I guess, easy hurdle to overcome. Like I said, the larger leaks and all the leaks you can find. And this is kind of, in talking with Michael Coates, who's the Twitter privacy and security officer, he talked about that's kind of their approach. Is they're trying to find everything that's out there that they can deal with and try to process to protect their users. But as you might guess, that also requires greater commitment to time and resources to try to address that. So if you haven't seen password leaks before, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. These are some from like Pastebin type sites where they're just text file type formats, usernames, passwords, emails. Some are going to have them in different order. Some will be tab delimited. Some will be space delimited. Some will be comma delimited. Some will have hash passwords. Some will have plain text passwords. Some will have passwords in a different table than they had usernames, so you'll have to try to correlate them. And just my point being that there's not a one-size-fits-all type approach to sucking in that data and having to process it. And in this case also, you can see these their passwords over here in parentheses that they've already cracked before they publish the dump out there. This one's more like a SQL type statement with all the different fields within there. So I looked at this back, it's been 3-4 years now, to try to get an idea of the scope of password leaks. And I wrote a blog post about it, which you can see here in the reference. But essentially over a 2-month period, I looked at how many dumps I could find that were specifically had. I think my criteria was more than 10 usernames and passwords in them, because some might just have like 2 or 3, and some might be like one single person had a Trojan on the system and they dumped all his information, kind of like a doxing type of attack. But these were the different results. So December, 154 different password dumps, 125 that had specifically organizations or a site specifically named as the source of that dump. Whether that was accurate or not, I didn't verify it. Plain text passwords, there were 66 dumps and 40 dumps, resulting in 221,000 and 61,000 respectively passwords, and then similar with hash passwords. So you can kind of see there's some variation. There's also variation in size. The dumps with less than 1,000 passwords, there was a pretty good number of those. And a lot of these are just smaller, less secure sites where they throw up a university in India throws up a CMS for their students to log in and get courseware, or a small retailer or something like that throws up a site. And I didn't count up the emails. There were emails included in the December dumps, but the January dumps, I actually did say which percent of the dumps had emails in them to give you an idea. The rest either had just usernames, or some of them may have just been passwords by themselves. To give you an idea of, are you going to be able to have access to those emails to know if they're your users or not? So roughly, that's this was a decent amount of work for me to parse through this, because there was dozens and dozens more dumps that I saw that didn't have password information in them. They were just config files or other data that was not passwords that I didn't want to have to deal with. And this was even, like I said, automating just I had to manually review them, but I could at least automate the scanning for them.
When you were looking for emails in there, I mean, emails are being used as usernames. Did you at any point see any leaks, or did you ever think about also looking for usernames that are something else than just an email address? Like, Twitter as an example, you can log in using your phone number if you have given them that You can log in on Twitter using your handle, or you can log in using your email address.
No, I didn't do any counting of usernames specifically. You can see like in some of these dumps, like this first one here on the left side, it's got a screen, I guess a screen name maybe. That's their username, and it also has their email. I couldn't tell you what that site allowed or used as a login. We know that a lot of sites on the internet, of course, use emails, but yeah, there may be cases where they could do either or. And we'll talk more about whether you want to parse usernames yourselves or against your own users or not, but that can be problematic. So that's kind of like the kitchen sink. You're looking for as much as you can. You're sucking that in, and I'll talk about some tools here in a minute that may make that easier for you. But you could also just look at the larger scale, and this is kind of a sampling of what's come out and what I would say has been generally available in the last few months of this year. Some of these didn't come from this year, like LinkedIn we know came from, I think, 2013, 2012, okay. And then MySpace is around that same time, and the Twitter one wasn't really Twitter, it was some other site, and they had 400 million entries, but only 32 million of them were unique entries. And so there's, but you may still find that data is still pertinent, and we'll talk about LinkedIn here in a little bit, but that data may still be relevant even if it's older. But as far as general availability, these are kind of what you're looking at as far as large numbers, clearly much larger than the, a few 10,000 password dumps that we see with just crawling Pastebin. And most of these you can't find on sites like Pastebin. You have to look for either people tweeting about them, or there's torrents, or maybe some other file sharing sources in the underground. The nice thing is, I guess, once more people get them, they tend to share them more. Like LinkedIn at first was kind of more harder to get a copy of, and now it's fairly easy if you know where to look for it. Let's see. All right. So some tools. Netflix is one of the organizations that does process for password leaks. And they came up with a tool, a Ruby on Rails application a few years ago, which they open sourced, called Scumbler. And that's not really a password leak processing tool so much as an intelligence gathering tool that looks for password leaks. So it's a tool that they have for data sources like the Pastebins, but also Facebook, Twitter. They can scan for Twitter. I'm trying to think, probably Google searches and some other stuff like that. But they essentially make it so if they want to put in Netflix password as a term in there, it gives them a workflow and kind of a checklist for them to go through of all the different sources that tool's found since the last time it's been run. You could schedule it to run daily or whatever, and retrieve that information, decide whether it's a threat you need to deal with, whether it's actual leaked passwords or not, and then and process it. Yes?
You'll also be really careful with Scumbler. By default, it will attempt to use email, and its original email source was actually, or its destination was not registered, so it was actually sending some of the reports to an unregistered email address.
Okay.
That was patched.
So he mentioned Scumbler's output as far as alerting you that you need to process data from it was originally email, and there were some quirks if you're using an older version of it, so make sure you're using a current version. But that's kind of their solution, and it works in with some other their tools as far as, like I said, the workflow behind how they process those leaks and decide, because they're looking for other stuff too. If someone says, hey, I hacked Netflix, but they're not dumping passwords, they're also interested in that type of data. So it's more of a general intelligence gathering, but it can be used specifically for password leaks. Dumpmon is a Twitter account, but it's also an open source project where they are crawling Pastebin for you. And I believe that was one of the primary sources I used when I was doing my research back in 2012 and 13. But you could customize that, since you've got the source code, to, instead of posting on Twitter, do the same type of thing. Write it into one of your ticketing systems, or send yourself alerts when you find specific strings that seem to match password dumps that you want to deal with. There are some sites that there's not really. Hashes.org is pretty much the best site that I'm aware of as far as current hash dumps. They seem to have a good, and they kind of disguise the name, like LinkedIn has a 1 instead of an I, because I guess they're trying to make it harder to search for. But they not only have the raw hashes, but they also have cracked hashes, so that can save you a lot of time if you want to just take advantage of their work that they've already done. Inside Pro is like I think a Russian password cracking site that they have forums where people share hashes and stuff like that. There's all sorts of other occasional sources that may have either older data, or they may leak something every once in a while, but it's kind of hard to find one good source on the internet that has everything you need in one place. Yeah.
Inside Pro is a little bit more nefarious than that. It's basically frequented by a large number of people with excess GPU capacity. You can basically post large dumps of uncracked hashes
Yeah.
and get them cracked. I've been watching specific actors responsible for some of the large cloud service provider breaches. And when they pick a new target, they'll pick like the hashes from maybe 50 or 60 employees at a particular cloud provider and pump them into Inside Pro with like anywhere from a $5 to $100 bounty per hash.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll usually get around 20 to 25% of the accounts reversed within about 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah.
So that's how
Yep.
effective it can be.
Yep. So he mentioned basically that Inside Pro does kind of like a crack for pay in their forms where you can say, hey, I want these cracked, and you can offer a bounty for it. And so it's not always just like good-natured password sharing. Sometimes it's more of the criminal element involved in that too. Of course, a lot of the dumps we've seen this year have been offered for sale initially, like the LinkedIn and MySpace data on, underground sites where they sell everything from drugs to, whatever else that you wouldn't be able to sell on a normal site. Those can be a little bit harder to track down just because you need to get access to them. Sometimes they're a little bit more careful about that. Sometimes they're not. Depends on which sites you're talking about. I'm not aware of any just like a underground, like a Carding Pro type site that's specifically focused on credentials. Their only interest is credentials, so it tends to be mixed in with the other, either data sales or things like that people may have, credit card sales, other types of data dumps that are out there. Law enforcement may also, I've heard cases, I think, with Time Warner Cable, where the FBI said, hey, we found this data we think may be associated with you, and you might want to take a look at it. I wouldn't count on them doing that for you. If they do, great, but it's probably more of a, try to know who your local cybersecurity person is in the Secret Service and FBI or your national law enforcement agency of choice. But that's it's nice if you get it, but I wouldn't count on it. There are a couple companies that are specifically focused on providing you with either password leaks or allowing you to check your users against the password leak data that they have collected. Hold Security is run by Alex Holden, which you've probably heard him in the news in the last few years, but they've got several, they have a pretty, I guess, mature program for going out there, getting large data leaks from their underground connections. They do crack some of the passwords themselves. They put in, it said like about a week's worth of effort. They do find a lot of plain text passwords, and their idea is that they sell you essentially an API service to query users and find out if your users, whether they're employees or customers, have passwords in their database. And if you need to crack them, you can crack them, do further cracking on your own. Leak Source is a little bit newer. They've also kind of focused more on the end user as far as you can go out there, plug in your email, and they'll show you which sites you've been, your credentials have been leaked through. But they are also offering a business option. Again, they do some password cracking themselves. They've got the API, and you would have to subscribe to that. Threat intelligence service providers I'm not as familiar with, and I would imagine that if they found a leak that had your name on it, they'd probably tell you about, but they may not be willing to share a Netflix dump with you if they found something like that. I don't have any, like I said, if you've got feedback on that, certainly feel free to pitch in, but I know that they'll at least alert of, hey, LinkedIn had this big credential dump and maybe something you're going to be aware of, but they may not provide you with that data directly.
Leak Source, though, doesn't just allow you to look at your end user's data. It allows you to search anybody's data.
Right. Yeah, he mentioned that Leak Source doesn't restrict you to just searching for your own user's data. You could essentially search for any matching emails within the dump. And I would imagine Hold Security is probably the same way, but I don't know that for sure. So you've got these leaks, whether you're pulling them from large sources or single sources, you've got to decide, make some choices on how to process that. The first one, like I mentioned, there's duplicates. So you probably would be good to have like an indexing type of a history where you're saying, okay, we've already done LinkedIn from 2012. We've already done blah, blah, blah. So you don't waste time going back over the same data, especially if you've got, you're parsing a lot of the small dumps where you're probably getting duplicates every month if you're doing that. The cleanup and conversion of data, some of this can be automated. Just things like I said, I showed you the different formats. There's headers and footers and different columns, and you can sometimes use regular expressions to pull out hashes and email addresses, but getting the other data may be problematic. So and then of course, if you're presumably going to filter that and focus on your users, you just care about the email addresses that match your user accounts. There's another decision about which users you're worried about. Pandora was the one that got the leaked in data, and any user with an email in that dump had their password reset or got flagged for password reset. They didn't try to crack the passwords. They didn't try to make sure that they were the same. That, as you might guess, angered some people that didn't use the same passwords, probably frustrated some others that weren't sure why that was going on. And again, it's kind of like that nuclear option of, we're not really willing to put in much effort into this, but we want you to be secure. So they're kind of pushing that back in the user's responsibility realm. Any user with a username appearing in the list, and kind of back to your question about if you should look at usernames, that can be problematic just because usernames aren't necessarily unique, globally unique. Email addresses are a little bit better about that, although they can be reassigned over time. But J Smith is a username. There's probably a lot of sites out there with a J Smith that isn't your J Smith. Alex Stamos also mentioned in that same presentation from the AppSec California that they do strip off the recipient of email addresses and check that against matching usernames within Yahoo. At least they did at the time for matches. So for them, but they were specifically also looking for password matches. So if the coincidence that J Smith 1 and J Smith 2 had the same password, J Smith was still getting a password reset even if he wasn't necessarily the same guy. And of course, the more precise option is to say if the username and email specifically match, that's who we're going to worry about putting through the reset process. So depending on what type of data you're dealing with, like I mentioned, sometimes you're getting hashes, sometimes you're getting plain text. Plain text, you're normally going to take that, put it through your normal hashing process. You may have to pull down the user's salt if you're hopefully, salting your password, so you would have to retrieve some of that data. If you have an existing API that this works well with, it may be fine. Otherwise, you may have to decide to design something specifically for password leak processing, either because you're dealing with different performance issues, or you do things in your normal login process that don't make that the right approach to take for this. If they are hashed, you're going to identify the hash, whether it's MD5 or SHA-1 or something else, and then have to decide how much effort you're going to put into cracking that. My recommendation would be to say we want to prevent people from getting their passwords cracked if they are having, similar to what the amount of effort an average attacker is going to be. So maybe that's a week, maybe that's 2-3 days. You're going to have to try to make that decision yourself. As far as the different approaches, we don't really need to get too much into that. You're going to try different approaches to crack the passwords. You can certainly customize that. Your policy is 8 characters and higher. You don't have to try to crack passwords lower than 7 characters. That can be problematic as far as the different hashes. This is data from a presentation that Rick Redmond did from CoreLogic a few years ago, where over a 6-month period, they gathered data on what types of hashes they saw on the dumps that they were capturing. MD5 was like 46% of all the dumps they saw. SHA-1 was, 4%, or it was much lower. But you can kind of see you're dealing with a lot of different options. And this is just the top ones. They had, a list of 30 or something that they gathered. And you can look at that source for more data. But the idea just being it's not going to be an easy, everything's MD5 or SHA-1. You may have to deal with more options than that. One alternative to hashing, or to going through the cracking process, is something that we learned about with the Facebook presentation that Alec Muffet did a couple years ago in PasswordsCon Oslo, or I'm not. Trondheim. Okay. He talked about how Facebook deals with passwords, and one of the things he mentioned was that before they use, I think, Scrypt, HMAC, and some others, so they're doing better security. But he mentioned that they do have an option for feeding passwords through MD5, the normal user passwords through the login process through MD5 first, and then into the more complicated, more secure systems. So if you find an MD5 dump and your user's passwords ahead of time have already been hashed with MD5 initially, and then your more secure alternatives, you can just skip that MD5 hashing process and put them through your more secure process. Again, maybe having to pull down salt values. But you could make that comparison even without having to crack the original password. Just, like I said, assuming MD5 to MD5, SHA-1 to SHA-1, you've got comparable types of approaches. If you're going to do that for more than one, like if you're going to do MD5 and SHA-1 and who knows what else, you may have to have additional records stored within your account database. You may not want to go through that much trouble. It kind of depends on how serious you want to take it and save yourself some trouble. One approach I thought of, which I'm not sure if it's good or bad because it's got some drawbacks, is instead of trying to crack those passwords, you decide to just compare users when they log in, take their plain text password they provide to you, hash it if you've already determined how those passwords have hashed, if they have a matching record in different dumps, make the comparison then without having to do any cracking on your own. So that's going to compare both the secure and less secure passwords. The problem is you kind of have to keep that database around for an indefinite amount of period of time. Maybe users don't log in except for every couple months. It's definitely more overhead. You may not want to have to deal with that, but it would get you out of some cracking work. So what to do and tell your users? You could just notify users. You don't have to necessarily force them to reset their password. That's kind of what LinkedIn did. LinkedIn, the initial dump had like some 6 million passwords in it. So I understand that they made those users reset passwords if they had a matching password. But the most recent dump that had all 117 million accounts in them had not been reset for the most part. In fact, LinkedIn reported of those like 117 million users, more than 100 million had not reset their password at all. And that was after all the media attention. LinkedIn was in the news a lot about being breached and passwords being compromised, but they didn't tell users to change it. And some users probably said, if I don't, if LinkedIn's not telling me to do it, I don't need to worry about it. So that's kind of the give it back in the user's hands, but they may not make the decision you want them to make. So if that's concerning to you, don't let them make the decision. You can lock the account. You can either do a custom unlock workflow where you say you have to go to this page to reset, recover from this, which some sites have done. Most of the larger ones seem to try to push people through the normal forgotten password workflow, because you've already got that in place. It's better to reuse that same code and functionality. The problem can be like in the Tumblr case where they had to reset some user passwords, is that this is literally the only message they gave their users. It's time to reset your password once they tried to log in. They didn't know why. They didn't have any context of why this was happening for them. So if you're going to put them in through your normal password workflow, you may want to have some sort of a flag you can set where it says, click here for more information, and it points them to a URL where you can explain why that's happening. You can do what Microsoft and Facebook and some others do, which is to not lock the account necessarily. They can still log into the account, but once they log in, they're required to go through a password reset workflow. But they're also subjected to that secondary authentication during that process. So they're looking at, are you coming from a country I know, are you coming from a browser I know, and things like that. And of course, invalidate session tokens is also important if you've got mobile apps or persistent cookies or something like that, where even if they may not be logging in, so you can't necessarily force them to your login workflow. I've got to kind of rush through this, but there's some important things to tell your users why it's happening. There's going to be confusion on their part. I don't recommend there's a question about the name of the third party. I would say typically you don't want to tell them where the leak came from, and that may cause some confusion, but as we'll talk about from a privacy standpoint, that could be problematic as well. Make sure you emphasize your site wasn't compromised. This is from a third party. Whether or not unauthorized access was detected on their specific account, that's also helpful for them to understand that you're protecting them. Education, media, some stuff like that. Nuisance leaks, I'm going to skip through this. Basically, just you may have to process stuff that didn't come from you. Like there was a release a few months ago where large email providers, and here's the actual headline that came with it, breach these big major email providers. Well, it wasn't a breach. That's just the way that Reuters decided to spin it. But they had to process this data, and they found that as far as a percent of the accounts that were in there, a very minimal amount were actually valid data. The vast majority was either old data, fake data. Regardless, they had to go through and process it.
So you're calling 2% a minimal?
Well, 2% of what was in there, what they were claiming, clearly 2% of meaning 476,000 accounts, that's pretty significant. But as far as the percent of
1% would be incredibly significant at any normal breach scale.
Yeah. My point is, like I said, not that you wouldn't care to reset this data, just that the data itself was, for the most part, bad data. It wasn't something that you would normally have to worry about, except for those small percents that you do.
Was it really bad data, or was it just mischaracterized data, like you were saying before, where somebody accumulates all these breaches and then sucks out just the Gmail addresses and says, hey, Gmail's been breached?
Yeah, and a lot of times we don't know. Like I'll mention, and this is some headlines from it, but some Pandora confusion. Well, I guess I don't have it in here. Someone basically said that Amazon Kindle was hacked. They had a record, 80,000 records, and that turned out to be entirely fake data. So sometimes it's completely made up. Sometimes it is just old data from collections that are years old that's no longer valid. But regardless. So quickly going over this, there is some risks involved with processing this. Like I said, users confused about how'd you know my password was in this leak? Are you keeping my password in plain text? Are you encrypting it? When Facebook announced their policy, there was a lot of comments on there, and as well as other news articles about it from users who were confused about that. Some people, if you lock the accounts, they're not going to be able to get back into their accounts. They've changed email addresses. They don't have access to their email. Their phone number's changed. Whatever recovery options you have for them aren't going to work. So just be aware you're going to have to deal with that in some cases. Privacy concerns. If you tell me, we found your password in Ashley Madison, or we found your password in Fur Affinity, I'm going to say, I'm not sure I want you to know that I was using that site. I haven't heard of people specifically being concerned about this, but I would not be surprised if I heard concerns from users being voiced. And notification fatigue, if this is happening every month, I could certainly see that being a problem. Legal risks, the short answer is talk to your legal team, because you're dealing with stolen data. From a US law perspective, federal law perspective, if you're not actively using that to compromise sites, you might be okay. From a trade secret intellectual property standpoint, it kind of depends on what data you have. And of course, avoid actually testing those credentials. So successes, WordPress went out there, looked at Gmail data that was compromised, found 100,000 users that use the same credentials, and they were able to reset those people's passwords before they got compromised. Yahoo, Alex Stamos again mentioned that they, in some of the bigger password dumps they deal with, 10 to 20% of the entries match their users, and they're able to get those passwords reset before it causes much trouble. And Twitter also felt like it was successful. So I like to feature my niece in every year's slides, and she's plugging the password leak, of course. This isn't going to solve all your problems when it comes to account takeover, but it may help you and demonstrate your commitment. So I'll open up for question and answer. I'll just kind of slowly tab through the references so we can get it recorded in the video, but I also have a link to my slides at the end, so you don't have to worry about writing these down. But any questions?
This is really just more of a comment, maybe to help. I recently did a analysis of the LinkedIn data against a large e-commerce site, and just against the subset of commercial customers, there were about a 16% overlap between the LinkedIn data and their active customers. And of those approximately 300,000 users, only 10% of them had changed the password since the LinkedIn breach. So that kind of gives you some sense of what the potential exposure is from these breaches, and giving you the incentive to go down this road.
Yeah.
Yeah, the customer angle, I guess I agree on the 10%. We tried resetting passwords, sent password reset email to about 4,000 people, and about 200 people changed their passwords. So it's a tricky issue. Yeah, you can easily off-put customers from your website easily by doing that. Also, an interesting observation. So all the leaks that recently have been for sale for $1 and all that stuff, it seems like the information that's being sold now is probably the same one that maybe Alex Holden has had for a number of years, only now gotten into somebody else's hands.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. A lot of them seem like it's people that they've maybe weren't even directly involved with the hacking it when it originally happened, but they were one of the inner circle of people that happen to have that private data, and they've decided now, well, I might as well sell it and try to get some money out of it, or share it, or whatever the case may be.
So you briefly touched on the possibility of storing user passwords in a weaker hash algorithm in order to compare against leaks or leak data. Do you have any advice for making your system robust such that If you decide to follow that strategy, you don't make your own system more risky or more risk prone to a dump.
Sure, and let me be clear on that. My advice is not that you store an MD5 record, password hash record for your users. It's that you hash with MD5, and then you use your scrypt or bcrypt or PBKDF2 on that on the resulting hash of that. So the idea being that you're starting from a known place, the MD5 hash. So if you get more MD5 hashes in from a leak, you can then put them through that same, starting on that step, put them through your stronger password hashing process, and then compare the results without having to crack those original MD5 passwords. But yeah, don't store like an extra record with MD5 or SHA-1 or anything weaker than that.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there, and I will give you the opportunity to have lunch. When we get back again, the next two talks are really taking us into the psychology and linguistics area of passwords, and I'm really looking forward to those talks as well. So be back here at 2 o'clock. Okay? Thank you.